Hello, my friend. Before we begin, I want to thank you for being here, because the story we're about to explore isn't just about a company, or a fortune, or even a man. It's about a dream that began in the most unlikely place, in the mind of someone who had no power, no money, and no reason to believe the world would ever know his name. This is a journey about curiosity, resilience, and the courage to see beyond what is into what could be. If you find this summary helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Booksnap, and comment below the title of the book you'd like us to summarize next. We'll make it happen soon. Imagine a boy in the late 1970s pedaling a squeaky bicycle down narrow tree-lined streets in Hangzhou, China. The air is damp with the smell of rain on stone, the kind that seems to deepen the quiet of the city. His bike is old, a little too big for him, but it carries him toward the edge of West Lake where tourists from faraway countries wander with cameras hanging from their necks. The boy's name is Ma Yun. The world will later know him as Jack Ma. At this moment, he's only 13, with a restless mind and a burning hunger to connect to something larger than the small apartment he calls home. He spots a couple from Australia standing by the water, looking puzzled as they study a paper map. He has been practicing English for months, memorizing phrases from a tattered notebook, and this is his chance. Nervously, he approaches them, blurting out a greeting in halting English. His pronunciation is far from perfect, but his eyes shine with sincerity. The couple smiles, surprised, and a conversation begins. They ask him to guide them around the city, and he agrees without hesitation, not for money but for the chance to speak, to learn, to touch another culture. This becomes his ritual. Every morning before dawn, Jack rides to the hotels where foreigners stay, offering free tours in exchange for English practice. He's paid in stories, tales of other cities, other foods, other ways of thinking. In a China still emerging from the shadow of the Cultural Revolution, these encounters are like cracks in a wall, letting in the light of a much wider world. At home, his parents worry. His father, a musician who plays traditional instruments, doesn't see the practical value in chasing strangers to learn their language. But Jack feels something different stirring inside him, a sense that language is more than words. It is a bridge, a passport, a key. One day, the Australian couple he befriended offers him a gift that will change his life, an invitation to visit them in Australia. For a boy who had never left Hangzhou, the idea feels like science fiction. It takes years before that trip actually happens, but the seed is planted. The belief that the world is vast and that he belongs in it. But here's the thing about Jack's early life. It is defined more by failure than by success. He fails his middle school exams twice before finally passing. He applies to dozens of jobs, as a waiter, as a hotel clerk, even as a police officer, and is rejected from all of them. When Kentucky Fried Chicken opens in Hangzhou, 24 people apply. 23 are hired. Jack is the only one turned away. Each no stings, but it also sharpens his resolve. He has no connections, no wealth, and no special privilege in a country where such things often determine one's fate. But he has two qualities that will become the pillars of his life: an unshakable curiosity and a refusal to quit. Every time the world closes a door, he looks for a window. In those long days of adolescence, Jack begins to realize that while he can't control how people see him now, skinny, unremarkable, often dismissed, he can control how much he learns, how he listens, and how he dares to imagine. He studies not just English, but the way people tell stories, the way they persuade, the way they see opportunity where others see walls. Hangzhou in those days is a city in transition, caught between the old rhythms of tea houses and the first stirrings of modernization. Foreign hotels rise near centuries-old temples, and street vendors call out prices in both yuan and awkward English. Jack rides through it all, absorbing the clash of past and future. It is this mix, the deep roots of tradition and the fresh wind of change, that shapes his worldview. He doesn't know it yet, But the boy who pedals his bicycle toward strangers every morning is building more than language skills. He's building the foundation for a life in which connecting people, across cultures, across continents, across the boundaries of the known, will become his mission. And while the world has not yet heard his name, the story of Alibaba has already begun, quietly in the streets of Hangzhou. Hangzhou in the late 1980s was not the bustling tech hub the world knows today. It was a quiet city framed by mountains and the shimmering expanse of Westlake, a place where bicycles outnumbered cars and ancient tea houses still whispered the slow rhythms of the past. Yet, for Jack Ma, this was no ordinary backdrop. Every street corner, every new hotel sign, every foreign face passing through the city was a reminder that the world outside China was inching closer. And if he could find a way to step through the right door, he might join it. By now, Jack had become something of a local oddity, the boy who spoke to foreigners without fear. He knew the hotel lobbies where international travelers stayed, knew the words to greet them, and the jokes that made them laugh. What he didn't know yet was just how rare his skill was in China at the time. English was still a novelty, a skill confined to classrooms and textbooks. But Jack didn't learn from grammar drills. He learned from listening to real people, catching the music of their words, and trying them out until they felt natural in his mouth. It was during this time that he met David and Ken Morley, the Australian family that would play a pivotal role in his life. They saw more than just a young tour guide. They saw ambition in his eyes, an openness to the world that felt rare and unshaped. Jack guided them through temples, markets, and gardens, explaining the history of each place in the best English he could muster. The Morleys, in turn, told him about Sydney's beaches, the Opera House, and a world of possibilities beyond China's borders. For years, Jack kept up correspondence with them through letters, each one a small exercise in English, a practice in clarity and persuasion. Then, one day, the unexpected happened, an invitation to visit Australia. For a young man who had never left Zhejiang province, the thought of stepping into another hemisphere was almost too big to grasp. When he finally made the trip in 1985, the shock was immediate. Australia was wide, open, and confident in a way that Hangzhou was not. The streets seemed cleaner, the air brighter, and the people spoke with an ease that fascinated him. Here he saw freedom of expression in action, people questioning authority openly, debating politics over coffee, and speaking to strangers without reserve. It was a revelation. The experience didn't make Jack love China any less, but it gave him something more valuable than simple admiration for the West: perspective. He realized that China's strength was not in mimicking other countries, but in finding its own voice in a rapidly connecting world. If Hangzhou was ever to truly open its hidden door to the world, it would need people who could stand between cultures and translate not just language, but understanding. Returning home, Jack carried with him a new kind of energy. But the city was still slow to change. The state-owned factories still clanked and hummed with old machinery, and most people saw foreign trade as something distant and abstract. For a young man burning with ideas, the challenge wasn't just to dream, but to find a place where those dreams could take root. He tried his hand at various ventures, many of them small and short-lived. Teaching English became his mainstay, and it was here that Jack began to sharpen another skill that would later define his leadership: storytelling. In the classroom, he realized that facts were rarely enough to inspire action. It was the way you told the story that made people lean forward in their seats. His lessons weren't dry recitations from a textbook. They were adventures, filled with characters and challenges, designed to make his students feel like they were part of something bigger. Outside the classroom, Jack began to imagine something that didn't yet have a clear form. He knew China's door to the world was opening wider. Foreign investment was trickling in, cities were modernizing, and talk of technology was beginning to circulate. He sensed that an era was coming when connection, not just production, would define success. But he didn't yet have the tool that would make this vision real. That tool would arrive years later in the most unexpected way. in a small, unremarkable office in the United States, where Jack would lay eyes on something that made his pulse quicken: the Internet. But for now, in the streets of Hangzhou, the door to that future was still just a faint outline, waiting for the right moment to swing open. The idea that failure could be a stepping stone rather than a dead end was not something Jack Ma read in a book. It was carved into him, one disappointment at a time. In China of the late 1980s and early 1990s, life was still shaped by limited opportunities and rigid systems. For someone like Jack, no family wealth, no political connections, no dazzling academic record, the road ahead was narrow. And yet, every rejection seemed to widen it in his mind. He failed his middle school entrance exams twice, then again for high school. When he finally graduated, he failed the National University entrance exam. Twice more. Each time, the failure could have been final. For many, it was. But Jack treated each setback like a bad hand in a long game, something to play through, not surrender to. On his third attempt, he scored just high enough to enter Hangzhou Teachers Institute, one of the city's less prestigious colleges. To others, it was a consolation prize. To Jack, it was a battlefield. He threw himself into English studies, not just to pass exams, but to keep alive the bridge to the outside world he'd built through his years with foreign tourists. He joined clubs, taught himself to speak with humor and warmth, and learned how to hold a room's attention. But when he graduated, the reality was brutal. The job market was tight, and his modest degree carried little weight. He applied to more than 30 positions, from waitstaff to hotel receptionist to police officer. The most famous rejection came from KFC. 24 people applied for jobs when the chain first opened in Hangzhou. 23 were hired. Jack was the only one turned away. These were the moments that could have broken him, but they also became his secret advantage. Where others saw a closed door, Jack saw an experiment. If the world doesn't want me that way, he thought, I'll find another way in. That other way turned out to be teaching. He landed a position as an English lecturer at a local college. The salary was meager, but the classroom gave him a stage. Here he learned the rhythm of speaking to groups, the art of simplifying complex ideas, the skill of making people believe in something. His students loved him not just because he was animated and funny, but because he treated them as equals, encouraging them to speak, to question, to imagine. Outside class, Jack began dabbling in small business ventures. He tried selling flowers, running translation services, even offering city tours for foreign visitors. Most of these ventures made little or no money, but each one taught him something about negotiation, about reading people, about what it took to turn an idea into action. Still, he was restless. Teaching was steady work, but the world beyond Hangzhou was changing fast. The early 1990s brought hints of something big. China was cautiously opening to foreign investment, and talk of new technology was starting to ripple through the cities. Jack could feel a wave building, one that might sweep past him if he stayed too comfortable. Then, in 1994, he took his first real leap into business by starting a translation company. It was a modest operation, but it positioned him at the crossroads of China's growing interest in foreign trade. Through his work, he began meeting entrepreneurs from abroad, listening to their frustrations about finding reliable partners in China. It was in these conversations that a question began to form in his mind. What if there was a way to connect these worlds directly? He didn't yet have the answer, but the pattern of his life was clear. Every failure had led to a skill. Every rejection had led to a connection. Every small win had opened a slightly bigger door. And now, without knowing it, Jack was walking toward the moment that would change everything, the moment he would see the Internet for the first time. It was early 1995 when Jack Ma boarded a flight that would carry him further from Hangzhou than he had ever been. The invitation had come from a Chinese trade delegation traveling to the United States, and his translation company had somehow landed a spot. For Jack, it was another chance to see the world. But he couldn't have guessed how a single afternoon in Seattle would ignite a vision that would change the course of his life. The trip began with a string of meetings, polite introductions, and business tours. Jack's role was simple: help translate conversations between Chinese and American entrepreneurs. He enjoyed it, but the schedule was mostly routine, until one of his American friends suggested they visit his home office to look at the internet. Jack had heard the word before, vaguely, but in 1995, China was still years away from widespread online access. The concept sounded abstract, almost science fiction. In the small office, his friend pointed to a beige computer with a bulky monitor and began explaining how it worked. The screen flickered, and Jack leaned forward. A white page loaded slowly, lines of text appearing like raindrops on glass. His friend typed a single word into a search box. Beer. Results appeared. All from the United States, Germany, Japan, but nothing from China. Jack blinked. How could it be that this vast, ancient country did not exist on this new map of the world? It was as if China had been left out of a global conversation that was already happening. Then, on impulse, Jack asked to search for China. Again, no results. Not one page. The realization hit him like a jolt. The internet wasn't just a tool. It was a blank canvas. And China's story hadn't been painted yet. They decided to try something bold. Jack and his friend created a simple web page for his translation business, Hangzhou Hope Translation Agency. The page went live, and within hours, emails began arriving. Small messages from people in Japan, the United States, Germany, asking about Chinese products and translation services. Jack sat stunned. He hadn't advertised. He hadn't told anyone. And yet, here were strangers from across the globe reaching out. It was as if he'd stumbled into a secret tunnel beneath the Great Wall, one that connected him instantly to the rest of the planet. In that moment, he understood two things with absolute clarity. First, that the internet would change business forever. Second, that if China didn't move quickly, it would be left behind. On the flight back to Hangzhou, Jack's mind raced. He thought of the factory owners he'd met through his translation work, frustrated at their inability to find foreign buyers. He thought of the foreign entrepreneurs who couldn't locate trustworthy partners in China. And he thought of his own years as a bridge between cultures. If the internet could connect these worlds directly, without middlemen or borders, the possibilities were endless. But in 1995, the idea was almost laughable in China. Most people didn't have computers, let alone modems. The government kept a tight grip on information, and convincing investors to pour money into something as abstract as online trade felt impossible. Jack didn't care. He had seen the future flicker on a computer screen, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The question was no longer whether the internet would change China. It was whether he would be the one to help make it happen. Back in Hangzhou, he began sketching out his first internet venture, China Pages. It would be an online directory for Chinese businesses, a place where companies could post information and foreign buyers could find them. He knew it was a primitive idea compared to what might come later, but it was a start. A first bridge over a gap that had been invisible until that afternoon in Seattle. The road ahead would be messy, full of false starts and resistance. But Jack was no stranger to resistance. He'd spent his whole life finding ways through walls others considered unbreakable. And now, with the internet in his sights, he was about to push against the biggest wall yet. The apartment was small, barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and a scattering of mismatched chairs. Yet, on a damp afternoon in February 1999, it became the birthplace of a company that would one day reshape how China, and eventually much of the world, did business. Jack Ma had called in a group of friends, former students, and trusted allies. Some had worked with him before. Others simply believed in his ability to make impossible things sound not only possible, but inevitable. They crammed into the living room, the air thick with the smell of instant noodles and the quiet hum of anticipation. Jack stood at the front, not with a business plan filled with neat charts and projections, but with a whiteboard and a dream. His voice was animated, his gestures wide. He spoke of a a digital marketplace where small Chinese businesses could reach buyers all over the globe, where the smallest factory could find its customer on the other side of the world, and where trade was no longer reserved for giants but open to everyone. The name, he explained, would be Alibaba. It came to him in a coffee shop in San Francisco during one of his trips abroad. Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, a tale known in every corner of the world, carried with it the magic of a simple password: Open Sesame. In Jack's mind, his platform would do exactly that: open the gates of opportunity for millions of small and medium enterprises. The people in the room weren't hearing about an online marketplace. They were hearing about a movement. Jack didn't promise quick riches. In fact, he warned them there would be no salaries for months, maybe longer. The only thing he could guarantee was hard work, uncertainty, and the possibility of changing something far bigger than themselves. One by one, they nodded. 17 of them joined him that day. Together with Jack, they would become known as the Alibaba 18. But their tools were humble. There were no powerful servers or sleek laptops, just a few old desktop computers, slow connections that made each page load like dripping water, and a handful of phone lines. Their first task was simple in theory but monumental in practice: convince small Chinese businesses, many of which didn't even own computers, to put their products online. Jack led by example. He called factory owners, visited workshops, and showed skeptical managers the basics of the Internet. Most of them stared blankly at the screen, unsure how this could possibly help them sell more. But Jack had a way of painting a picture so vivid they could almost see their goods being shipped overseas. The workdays bled into nights. They coded, they called, they coaxed reluctant suppliers into trying something new. The team ate together, argued together, and often fell asleep at their desks. Money was tight. The apartment rent was barely manageable. Some family members worried they were throwing away stable careers for a fantasy. But for Jack and his team, this wasn't just about making money. It was about being first. They knew the Internet was coming to China, and when it did, they wanted Alibaba to be the door everyone walked through. Their first site was simple, almost crude by today's standards: product listings, company profiles, contact details. But it worked. Slowly, small manufacturers began to see results. Orders trickled in from buyers in faraway countries, proving that the idea was not only real, it was powerful. Jack reminded his team constantly that they weren't building a company for themselves alone. "If we don't help small businesses," he said, "we will never be a great company. Our customers' success will be our success." It became the heartbeat of Alibaba's culture, a belief that they were in the business of empowerment as much as e-commerce. In that cramped Hangzhou apartment with wires running across the floor and stacks of paperwork on every surface, the foundation was laid. What they lacked in resources, they made up for in conviction. They weren't just starting a business, they were lighting a fuse. And soon, the spark that had been struck in Jack's mind back in Seattle would begin to catch fire across China. In the China of 1999, the word Internet still felt foreign on most people's tongues. For factory owners and small business managers, the concept of selling online sounded as far-fetched as building a store on the moon. Jack Ma knew this, and he knew that if Alibaba was going to survive, he would have to convince the skeptics one conversation at a time. He started with people he already knew: small manufacturers he'd met through his translation company, business owners who trusted him enough to hear him out. He would walk into their workshops, rooms buzzing with the sound of sewing machines or clanging metal, and sit down with the owner over tea. "I'm not here to sell you a product," he'd begin, leaning forward, eyes bright. "I'm here to give you a new market." Then he'd pull out a laptop, slow, bulky, often unreliable, and connect it to the Internet through a dial-up modem. The screen would load painfully slowly, the connection occasionally dropping mid-demo. But Jack didn't apologize for the clunkiness. Instead, he used it to his advantage. If this is what the Internet looks like today, imagine what it will be like tomorrow. If you start now, you'll be ready when everyone else wakes up. Most of his audience laughed politely, then shook their heads. They preferred the safety of trade fairs, middlemen, and personal connections. The internet felt too impersonal, too risky. What if the buyers never paid? What if the orders were fake? What if this was just another passing fad? Jack understood their fears. So instead of trying to bulldoze through them, he told stories. He painted vivid pictures of a small silk workshop in Hangzhou shipping scarves to Paris, a toy maker in Shantou selling directly to a store in Chicago. He spoke not just of profits, but of pride, the kind of pride that came from seeing your work in the hands of people halfway across the world. His passion was infectious. Even those who didn't fully understand the technology found themselves wanting to be part of whatever future Jack was describing. One by one, he persuaded the first wave of merchants to try Alibaba. Inside the company, the work was relentless. The Alibaba 18 became evangelists, traveling to factories, organizing small seminars, and training business owners to upload product photos and write descriptions. Many of these merchants had never used a computer before. Some didn't even own one. So Alibaba helped them set up email accounts, scan product images, and navigate the simple, clunky site. The challenge wasn't just technology, it was trust. In a culture where face-to-face deals had always been the norm, doing business with an unseen buyer across the globe felt risky. Jack hammered home a simple principle. Alibaba had to become the most trustworthy platform in China. If people didn't trust them, they were finished before they began. He set an example by putting customers first, even when it cost the company money. If an order went wrong, the team personally helped fix it. If a merchant had trouble understanding how to use the platform, someone from Alibaba would spend hours walking them through it. Slowly, these acts of service built something more valuable than early revenue: loyalty. Yet, outside their growing circle, skepticism remained strong. Some competitors mocked Alibaba as a talk shop, a place where people listed products but no real deals happened. Investors hesitated. In a China still cash-driven, the idea of paying for something online seemed absurd to many. But Jack thrived on being underestimated. He had learned early in life that when people doubt you, it gives you space to move before they notice you're winning. And beneath the slow dial-up connections and small victories, he could feel momentum building. The team didn't yet know it, but the day would come when Alibaba's biggest challenge wouldn't be convincing people the internet worked. It would be surviving the storm when the global internet economy collapsed. And that storm was already forming on the horizon. Alibaba was no longer just a small experiment in a Hangzhou apartment. It was beginning to attract attention. The number of businesses signing up to list their products was climbing. Orders from overseas were trickling in more steadily. Jack and his team felt the excitement of being early pioneers in a gold rush. But then, in 2000, the gold market itself began to collapse. The dot-com bubble, a frenzy of internet speculation in the West, had inflated stock prices and startup valuations to dizzying heights. Companies with little more than a website and a catchy name were suddenly worth millions. But just as quickly, the bubble burst. Across the globe, internet companies folded overnight. Investment money dried up. The very word .com began to sound like a warning rather than a promise. For Alibaba, the impact was immediate and severe. Venture capitalists who had once called Jack with offers of funding stopped returning his calls. Some potential partners backed away entirely, unwilling to risk their resources on an unproven Chinese internet company. The skepticism that had always lingered around Alibaba now turned into open doubt. "The internet is over," people told him. This was just a fad. Inside the company, the mood grew tense. Their bank account was shrinking, and the revenue from online listings wasn't enough to cover expenses. The Alibaba 18 were still working long hours, but the energy in the office had shifted from excitement to quiet worry. Would they survive the year? Jack refused to let fear become the company's compass. He gathered the team and told them, "If we are going to die, we will die standing. If we are going to live, we will live together." Then he made a decision that would shape the company's DNA. they would not lay off employees. Other companies in the tech world were cutting costs by firing staff, but Jack saw Alibaba's people as its core strength. "If we keep our team together," he told his managers, "we can rebuild when the market recovers. If we break apart now, we lose everything." That decision forced them to make sacrifices elsewhere. Salaries were frozen, every expense was scrutinized. Travel was cut to the bare minimum. The team began working even longer hours, doing more with less, driven by the belief that they were protecting something worth fighting for. In those months, Alibaba's survival depended on relentless creativity. If they couldn't afford big marketing campaigns, they relied on word of mouth. If investors were wary, they focused on merchants who already trusted them, doubling down on customer service. Every small success, a manufacturer finding a new buyer, a foreign customer returning with a larger order, became fuel for morale. Jack also began to articulate a philosophy that would carry Alibaba forward. Customers first, employees second, shareholders third. It was an inversion of the standard business model, but it made sense to him. Without customers, there was no business. Without employees, there was no service. And if those two were strong, the shareholders would eventually benefit. Slowly, the internet winter began to thaw. In China, more people were getting online, and businesses were starting to see the advantage of having a digital presence. Alibaba emerged from the storm battered but alive, one of the few internet companies of its generation to survive intact. The team didn't yet know it, but their real tests were still to come. For now, they had proven something to themselves. They could withstand a global crisis without breaking apart. And when the next challenge came, in the form of a global giant trying to dominate their home market, they would need every ounce of that hard-earned resilience. The worst of the dot-com winter had passed, but Jack Ma knew survival alone wasn't enough. If Alibaba was going to grow into the company he envisioned, it couldn't be built solely on clever strategy or lucky timing. It needed something deeper, a culture so strong that it could weather any storm, a shared sense of purpose that would bind people together when the numbers looked grim. In 2001, Jack formalized what would later be known as the Alibaba Partnership. It wasn't about stock options or flashy perks. It was about trust, responsibility, and a shared mission. The Alibaba 18, and those who joined in the years to come, weren't just employees. They were custodians of an idea, that the internet could empower small businesses in a way the world had never seen. Jack had learned from his teaching days that people don't work hardest for money alone. They work hardest for a story they believe in. At Alibaba, that story was simple. Make it easy to do business anywhere. Everything, from the way they treated customers to the way they resolved internal disagreements, had to feed back into that mission. He began codifying the company's values in ways that were both serious and playful. There were the 6 vein sword principles, borrowed from martial arts novels, each representing a guiding value: customer first, teamwork, embrace change, integrity, passion, and commitment. These weren't just slogans on a wall. Jack used them in meetings, in hiring decisions, in performance reviews. He even encouraged employees to challenge decisions if they felt those values were being ignored. The atmosphere in the Hangzhou office was unlike most Chinese workplaces of the time. There were no rigid hierarchies, no endless layers of bureaucracy. New hires could question managers. Mistakes were treated as lessons rather than failures, provided you owned up to them quickly. And while the work hours were long, there was a sense of camaraderie that made them bearable. Team bonding was intentional. Alibaba's offices rang with birthday songs, team dinners, and the occasional absurd company skit. Jack himself wasn't afraid to be silly. At annual events, he might show up in a rock star costume, singing to his employees. It was part of his way of breaking down walls, reminding everyone that even in a company chasing global ambitions, joy mattered. The partnership culture extended beyond Alibaba's walls. Jack wanted his customers, the small businesses taking a chance on this new online world, to feel like they were part of the journey too. That meant listening to them, adapting the platform to their needs and making them feel supported. It also meant standing up for them when bigger players tried to push them aside. This foundation of loyalty and shared ownership would prove critical in the battles ahead, because in 2003, a formidable opponent would enter the scene. eBay, the American giant of online marketplaces, flush with cash and eager to claim China as its next great conquest. Jack understood instantly what was at stake. If eBay succeeded, it could control not just the consumer market but also the future of online trade in China. And Alibaba, still young and fragile, could be crushed before it truly found its footing. The team braced themselves. They had survived the collapse of the dot-com bubble, but now they were about to face an opponent with far more resources, brand recognition, and experience. And yet, in Jack's mind, this wasn't just a fight for market share. It was a fight for identity, for the idea that a Chinese-born company could stand toe-to-toe with a global giant and win. In 2003, the news broke like a thunderclap in China's fledgling e-commerce world. eBay, the undisputed giant of online auctions in the West, was entering the Chinese market. They were armed with deep pockets, advanced technology, and the confidence of a company that had already conquered much of the globe. For many observers, it was a foregone conclusion. eBay would sweep in, dominate, and leave little room for local players. Jack Ma didn't see it that way. To him, eBay's arrival was both a threat and a gift. The threat was obvious. Their resources dwarfed Alibaba's. But the gift was subtler. eBay's presence would accelerate public understanding of online marketplaces, opening the door for a rival to slip in with something better suited to Chinese consumers. Jack intended for that rival to be Alibaba. The problem was that Alibaba's core business at the time, connecting small manufacturers to overseas buyers, wasn't designed for the consumer-to-consumer market that eBay specialized in. To take on eBay directly, they would need something new. That something became Taobao. The name, meaning searching for treasure, captured the feeling Jack wanted people to have, that shopping online wasn't just a transaction. It was an adventure. In a small secret room inside Alibaba's Hangzhou office, a team of engineers, designers, and marketers began building the site. The secrecy was deliberate. Jack didn't want news of Taobao leaking to the press or, worse, to eBay before they were ready. From the beginning, Jack made one critical decision that set Taobao apart. It would be free for sellers. eBay, operating under its standard global model, charged listing fees. In China, where online selling was still a leap of faith for most, those fees were a barrier. By removing them entirely, Taobao lowered the risk for small merchants to experiment with online sales. The second innovation was cultural. Jack knew that Chinese buyers and sellers valued personal trust above all else. So Taobao introduced an instant messaging tool called Aliwangwang, allowing buyers and sellers to chat directly before making a deal. This small feature tapped into something deeply ingrained in the culture, the idea that you could judge someone's honesty through conversation. eBay, with its more rigid auction structure and lack of live interaction, couldn't match this. When Taobao launched, it entered a market already buzzing with eBay's publicity. The American giant had partnered with EachNet, China's largest auction site at the time, and poured millions into marketing. But Taobao moved fast. They localized everything: the language, the payment methods, even the look and feel of the site. They understood that in China, color palettes mattered, the rhythm of festivals mattered, and shopping was as much about relationship as price. Jack threw himself into the campaign. He appeared in commercials, spoke at events, and positioned Taobao not as a cold, transactional platform, but as a community. In one now famous ad, he declared, "In the West, e-commerce is a dessert. In China, it's the main course." Still, the fight was brutal. eBay's war chest was enormous, and their global brand gave them an aura of inevitability. But Taobao had something eBay didn't: a willingness to adapt instantly to the quirks of the local market. When Chinese buyers showed hesitation about paying online, Taobao introduced an escrow-based system called Alipay, holding funds until the buyer confirmed satisfaction. This simple trust-building mechanism would go on to transform not just Taobao, but the entire Chinese e-commerce landscape. By the end of 2004, eBay was struggling to gain traction while Taobao's market share was climbing fast. What had looked like a mismatch on paper was turning into a story of local knowledge outmaneuvering global might. Inside Alibaba, the atmosphere was electric. They weren't just surviving, they were winning. For Jack, the Taobao gambit was more than a business move. It was proof of a belief he had held since his days as a boy guiding tourists around Hangzhou, that to win trust, you have to speak people's language. Not just their words, but their values, their habits, and their dreams. And in China's online shopping revolution, no one spoke that language better than Alibaba. Winning against eBay was a triumph. But Jack Ma knew that victory in market share was only the beginning. The real war was for trust. And in early 2000s China, trust in online transactions was almost non-existent. Most Chinese consumers still preferred cash on delivery or face-to-face exchanges. They feared sending money into the digital void, unsure if they would ever see their product or their money again. And they had reason to worry. The internet in China was young, unregulated, and often chaotic. Counterfeit goods flooded marketplaces, scammers popped up overnight, and stories of buyers being cheated traveled fast. Jack understood that without a rock-solid foundation of trust, Taobao and Alibaba could crumble no matter how big they became. Trust, he believed, wasn't something you could buy with advertising. It had to be earned, and it had to be built into the very bones of the business. The breakthrough came in the form of Alipay. The concept was simple but radical for the time. When a buyer made a purchase, their payment would be held in an escrow account managed by Alipay. Only when the buyer confirmed they had received the product in good condition would the money be released to the seller. This created a layer of security that reassured both sides. Buyers didn't risk losing their money, and honest sellers could prove their legitimacy. It was an elegant solution, but also a dangerous one. There were no clear regulations for such a service in China at the time. In fact, some legal advisors warned Jack that holding customers' money without a banking license could bring serious trouble. Jack listened, then made a decision in typical Jack Ma fashion. If we don't try it, we'll never know. And if we wait for permission, we'll miss our chance. Alipay launched, and almost immediately it began to change the game. Consumers who had been hesitant to shop online began trying it. Sellers saw orders increase as the barrier of mistrust fell. Over time, Alipay became not just a payment tool, but a symbol of security in China's e-commerce world. But trust wasn't only about payments. Alibaba had to confront the plague of counterfeit goods. Many sellers, especially small traders, saw fakes as a quick way to boost profits. If Alibaba turned a blind eye, they risked becoming a marketplace people avoided. If they cracked down too hard, they risked alienating sellers who were still learning the ropes of legitimate online business. Jack chose a middle path, one that required relentless effort. Alibaba began creating systems to verify sellers, flag suspicious listings, and respond quickly to consumer complaints. They launched education campaigns to teach sellers why building a reputation for authenticity would serve them better in the long run. They weren't perfect, and the problem never fully disappeared, but their stance sent a clear message. Trust was not negotiable. Inside the company, Jack's mantra became, "We are not an internet company. We are a trust company that happens to use the internet." Every decision, from user interface design to customer support policies, was measured against that idea. If it didn't build trust, it wasn't worth doing. By the mid-2000s, Taobao wasn't just a website. It had become a marketplace people felt safe using, a place where the click of a button could connect a teenager in Beijing with a craftsman in a rural village, and both could walk away satisfied. Still, Alibaba's ambitions were growing beyond China's borders. Building trust at home had been a battle. Building it internationally would require a different kind of strategy, and that challenge would take them all the way to Wall Street. By the early 2010s, Alibaba was no longer the scrappy upstart in a Hangzhou apartment. It was a sprawling ecosystem. Taobao dominating consumer-to-consumer sales, Tmall catering to major brands, Alipay transforming online payments, and Alibaba.com still powering international trade for small businesses. Inside China, its influence was woven into daily life. Outside China, however, many still saw it as an unfamiliar name. Jack Ma understood the symbolism of perception. If Alibaba was going to be seen as a global company, not just a Chinese success story, it needed a defining moment on the world stage. That moment would come in the form of an initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange. The decision wasn't just about raising capital, it was about legitimacy. Listing in New York meant subjecting the company to the scrutiny of international investors, regulators, and analysts. It meant saying to the world, "We are here, and we belong among the biggest." But it also carried risks, from geopolitical skepticism to intense financial transparency. Jack knew every number would be picked apart, every strategy questioned. Preparation for the IPO was grueling. Teams combed through years of financial data, tightened corporate governance, and rehearsed presentations for investors who had only a vague idea of what Alibaba actually did. Unlike a company selling a single product, Alibaba had to explain an entire digital ecosystem, one that combined the functions of eBay, Amazon, PayPal, and more, adapted to the unique fabric of China's market. When Jack traveled to the United States for the Investor Roadshow, he brought with him the same storytelling energy he had used years earlier to convince skeptical factory owners. In meeting after meeting, he spoke about empowering small businesses, about leveling the playing field for entrepreneurs who had once been invisible in the global economy. His pitch wasn't about quarterly earnings. It was about building an economy where dreams had fewer barriers. On September 19, 2014, Alibaba went public in what became the largest IPO in history at the time, raising $25 billion. As the opening bell rang on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, Jack stood smiling in a tailored suit, but his eyes carried the same spark he had as a young English teacher in Hangzhou. For him, the moment wasn't just about money. It was proof that a Chinese internet company could play at the highest global level without abandoning its roots. The IPO sent a message not only to investors but to millions of small businesses in China. If Alibaba could go from a cramped apartment to Wall Street, so could they reach beyond their own limitations. Jack often reminded his team that this victory belonged to every merchant, coder, delivery driver, and customer who had believed in the idea along the way. But Jack also knew that success on this scale could be dangerous. Public markets bring pressure. The demand for constant growth. The scrutiny of shareholders who may not care about long-term vision. The challenge would be to protect Alibaba's culture and mission in a world that now measured it in stock price. For now, though, the company stood at a peak few had imagined possible 15 years earlier. And while the spotlight was bright, Jack was already looking toward the next phase, one that would take him away from the CEO's chair and into a new chapter of his life. By the time Alibaba's IPO dust had settled, Jack Ma was not only the face of one of the most influential companies in the world, he had become a symbol. To entrepreneurs, he was proof that someone with no elite background, no connections, and a long trail of rejections could still bend the arc of their life toward something extraordinary. But Jack himself had always been wary of symbols. He knew that icons can become traps, freezing a person into a single image. In 2013, a year before the IPO, he had already stepped down as Alibaba's CEO, handing the role to Jonathan Liu, a longtime insider. Jack remained executive chairman, guiding vision rather than daily operations. It was a transition that puzzled some outsiders. Why would a founder step back when his company was still ascending? But Jack had never seen Alibaba as his personal empire. In his mind, Leadership meant knowing when to leave space for others to grow. After the IPO, Jack's focus began to shift. He had always been fascinated by education, recalling his own years as a teacher and the joy he found in helping others discover their potential. In speeches, he began to talk less about market share and more about humanity's shared future, about technology's role in solving problems like environmental degradation, rural poverty, and access to education. He poured energy into philanthropy, establishing initiatives to improve rural schools in China, train young entrepreneurs, and support environmental conservation. Through the Jack Ma Foundation, he aimed to blend his love for teaching with his belief that the Internet could be a force for good far beyond business. His departure from the executive chairman role in 2019 was marked by a farewell celebration that felt more like a rock concert than a corporate event. Wearing a leather jacket and holding a microphone, Jack stood before tens of thousands of Alibaba employees in a Hangzhou stadium. He thanked them, reminded them of the mission, and urged them to keep the spirit of curiosity and resilience alive. "It's not about how much money you have," he told them. "It's about how many people you've helped." Stepping away didn't mean disappearing. Jack continued to travel, speak at global forums, and mentor young founders. But his life became less about Alibaba's next quarterly results and more about planting seeds. In education, in philanthropy, in the belief that courage and kindness could be just as disruptive as any new technology. His legacy, in the end, wasn't just Alibaba's market value or its dominance in e-commerce. It was the idea that a company could be built around serving the smallest players, that trust could be a business model, and that resilience in the face of rejection could be the most valuable currency of all. For those who had followed his journey from the boy on a bicycle in Hangzhou to the man ringing the bell on Wall Street, the message was clear. The real, open sesame wasn't a password or a platform. It was a mindset, one that saw the world not as it is, but as it could be, and dared to ride toward it even when the path seemed impossible. 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 Path seemed impossible.